Yeah, the island fox story is well known to many of you. A lot of us have been living it for a long time. I was here at the park and began monitoring island foxes before we had a crisis, and many of us have lived through the crisis. And it is a very compelling story. There's a lot about the island ecosystem that's tied up into the story of the island fox. And when you talk about island fox recovery, it's not just the Park Service that has been doing this. It's been a group effort of probably more than 250 to 300 people that have been working on island foxes and on island fox recovery since the crisis began, or we knew we had a crisis in 1999, and now we've come not all the way on the other side of it, but pretty far that way. And we've had some great partners along the way that includes our co-owner on Santa Cruz Island, the Nature Conservancy, nonprofits like the Institute for Wildlife Studies, Dave Garcelon's group, and they've done all the restoration of bald eagles on the islands, and they've also worked on island foxes on all islands where they occur. The U.S. Navy, the University of California, the Santa Barbara Zoo, and the whole zoo community offered us all these resources when we found ourselves in the captive breeding business for island foxes suddenly in 1999. So it's been a great group effort. In fact, that's one of the many lessons that I've taken away from this, is that it's almost like it takes a village type of thing. And help is there if you want it. All you got to do is ask. And people come out of the woodwork to work on island foxes with us. One thing I'm going to emphasize tonight is something, two concepts, keeping every cog and wheel, and something called intelligent tinkering. And those come from a person that many people call the father of conservation biology, Aldo Leopold, who worked for the Forest Service and was a professor in Wisconsin in the early and mid part of the 20th century. And he did a lot of the first critical thinking about ecosystem management, not just single species management, but ecosystem management. So he had a quote, "If the biota in the course of eons has built something we like but do not understand, then who but a fool would discard seemingly useless parts? To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering." And so in the past 20 years or so, there has been some intelligent tinkering going on with ecosystems of the Channel Islands, and we'll talk about that. And because of that, we're not going to lose the cog in the wheel that is the island fox. The island fox, of course, as most of you know, is one of the most unique carnivore species in the world. It's one of the smallest. It's one of the most geographically restricted. It's only as big as a house cat, as we say. It's 4 to 5 pounds. The geographic restriction comes in because it only lives on the 6th largest of the 8 Channel Islands. That's the only place in the world where it lives. So it has the most restricted range of any carnivore in the world. That and a small size, a small population size. Some of these islands are pretty small, San Miguel and San Nicolas, and island foxes probably never existed at populations more than 400 or 500 animals on those islands. So it's kind of vulnerable to begin with, just based on that. They eat everything that's out there. They're pretty amazing. And of course, dogs are true omnivores, canids are omnivores, and they'll eat almost anything you put in front of them. Certainly the island fox is like that. They take mice, birds, lizards. They love fruits of even ice plant, which is a non-native, but some of the native ones like toyon as well. They eat a lot of insects and invertebrates when those come in season. So they take advantage of every food item that's out there. Some of them even go down to the beaches and forage on pinniped carcasses. Some of them will even eat the carcasses of deer and elk that were on Santa Cruz Island. They live in pairs. They live about 10 years in the wild. They'll breed, they'll pair for life pretty much. And they have one litter of about 2 pups every April. So they don't have a real large litter the way other canids do. And this is because they live in a restricted environment. Everything's restricted on the islands. You know, the territories are smaller, the populations are more dense, and they have less kids out there. They just don't have the big litters that a lot of other canids do. And of course, they're not as nocturnal as some other canids or some other carnivores. You can see them in the daytime out on the islands, and that's because they evolved pretty much without a predator. There was no larger carnivore on the island. They're the largest terrestrial carnivore out there. Their only competition is the spotted skunk, which exists on Santa Cruz and Santa Rosa Island. There's no coyotes, there's no wolves. There was never a large diurnal or daytime raptor out there either, which that's one of the causes of the predicament that they got into. They got out there, they haven't been out there for that long, which is amazing to me. Many species that you see are the products of millions of years of speciation and evolution. Well, the mainland gray fox is the ancestor of the island fox, and the island fox has probably only been on the islands for about 10,000 years. And it's pretty amazing to think about that, because there's been a lot of rapid evolution since that time. But back in the Pleistocene, go back, the sea levels were lower, therefore the land masses were, they're all one land mass in the Northern Channel Islands here. One island called Santa Rosa, a super island, and it was fairly close to the mainland. It was never connected to the mainland. But one possibility is that mainland gray foxes were rafted out to the island on some of the big El Nino-driven storms that just coursed the water down the Ventura River and the Santa Clara River, the two rivers that bracket the city of Ventura. And vegetation mats have been found floating out to sea. In fact, they end up on some of the islands, and non-native species get established that way. And it's entirely possible that a pregnant gray fox or two made its way out there, and from there, the species began. It's also possible that Native Americans brought gray foxes with them to the islands in that time, because we don't have an island fox fossil that's older than human occupation in this part of the world. So that's entirely possible too. In any case, they haven't been out there very long at all. But they've actually rapidly evolved. We know that Native Americans brought them from the northern Channel Islands to the southern Channel Islands in their tamals or their plank canoes. They enjoyed a special relationship with Native Americans. Native Americans did not eat them. We know that because we don't find their bones in the kitchen middens of Native Americans on the islands. And in fact, they probably had almost a religious significance to the Native Americans on the islands. And that's true in some of the Chumash legends that you hear about today. And you find them in burials, though. So you don't find them in middens, but you do find them in burials. And they tame down very easily, and they would have been a great camp pet, so to speak, for the Chumash or any other Native American. They would have kept their camps clean of mice and other vermin, and so they were probably tamed down to a certain degree by Native Americans, and they made it to the southern Channel Islands in that fashion. And if you have been paying attention the past 10 or 20 years, you know that island fox story is one characterized by these massive declines that occurred in the mid-1990s. On the northern Channel Islands, we saw our fox populations go on San Miguel from about 400 foxes down to 15 in 1999. We ended up with 15 foxes in Santa Rosa after starting with maybe as many as 1,600. And at Santa Cruz, the population fell to below 100, probably below 50 by 2000, where it had started out about 1,400. Research showed in the mid-1990s. At the same time, in the southern Channel Islands, on Catalina Island, the fox population crashed precipitously in 1999-2000, and that was caused by canine distemper virus, which we'll get into a little bit more. But it was a very different cause of decline than in the north, in the national park here. As a result of these declines, these 4 subspecies of island foxes, and there's 6, the 4 of the 6 were listed as endangered by the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2004, which was several years after the crisis was apparent, but the wheels of bureaucracy move rather slowly, as we all know. But that's how serious the declines became. And of course, when you have 15 animals left in a species or a subspecies, that's pretty much 1 foot in the grave type situation. In fact, of those 15 animals, only 4 were males. And of those 4 males, only 2 ever bred for us in captivity. So all the foxes on San Miguel right now are descended from 2 males in 1999, which is pretty weird to think about. But we'll talk a little bit about how we discovered the decline. It's through what we call ecological monitoring. We monitor the health of the park ecosystem. We've picked several species or suites of species that we think are important to monitor, and it was easy to pick island foxes because they're so unique. And they're so naturally vulnerable because of their low population sizes. So in 1993, we started monitoring them by trapping them on small grids out on San Miguel Island for 6 nights in a row. The foxes were pretty easy to handle. You don't need to knock them down with chemical immobilization or anything like that. On the other hand, we've all been bitten by island foxes, everyone. So we probably should have knocked them down. But we mark them with these passive integrated transponder or pit tags, about as big as a grain of rice, and we put them between between the shoulder blades with a big needle, and it's typically done for pets nowadays. And the great thing about these is they stay in there for the life of the animal, and you can read them with a pit tag reader. And so every year we would come back and see how many foxes survived and essentially count them that way. And the first couple of years we did this, life was good. You know, we had a lot of foxes on San Miguel, and then we started seeing a decline in 1995 that kept going until 1999. And monitoring will tell you how many animals you have, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what's going on. So we had to conduct research to find out the cause of the decline. We put radio collars on island foxes, and those radio collars were what we call mortality collars. And if that fox sits in one place for more than 6 hours, a different signal comes out, and it tells us that fox is probably dead. And so because of that, we can find the carcass and identify the cause of death, which we did, and we were very surprised to find that predation by golden eagles was killing our foxes in 1998 and 1999. And this is surprising because golden eagles were not known from the islands. They had never bred there naturally. Bald eagles had for many years. They were gone because of organochlorine contamination, DDT, but bald eagles had never been known to breed out there. Golden eagles, thank you. But we knew it was golden eagles that were doing this because golden eagles have a certain way of eating a prey animal, and the characteristics that we found on the fox carcasses were exactly like that. Eagle feathers we found at the kill sites were identified as golden eagle feathers by the forensics lab, pretty much, up in Ashland, Oregon, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service lab, which does this kind of thing all the time and with great technology. And they were very, very exact. In fact, they told us that some of the first feathers we found were the rump feathers of a juvenile golden eagle, and that's very specific. And lately we've been doing genetics on the eagle feathers that we find out there too, and that tells us just how related the eagles were to each other when they started the population out there in the 1990s. And the last, now foxes were pretty vulnerable to eagle predation because, one, they're so small. You know, they're 4 or 5 pounds. That's right in the prey size range for a golden eagle, which on the mainland, golden eagles specialize in rabbits and in ground squirrels. So pretty small prey. And actually, adult foxes are right in that prey size. And they're not strictly nocturnal. You can see this right here during the daytime. That fox is going to be vulnerable to any aerial predator that's out there. They never learn to look to the sky for death coming down on them. So that part of their evolution worked against them when golden eagles showed up in the islands. And it's also true that many of the native shrublands had been converted to grasslands by a history of grazing out on all the islands. And that probably also contributed to their vulnerability. It was almost a perfect storm of factors that allowed foxes to almost go extinct in the mid-1990s. Had any one of those factors not been there, I don't think they would have. In some degrees, it's amazing that we still have island foxes on San Miguel at all. It was heavily grazed by sheep in the early part of the 20th century, overgrazed by sheep. And then a 6-year drought hit around the 1930s, and it really caused most of the island to become bare of vegetation. And the prevailing northwestern wind just stripped San Miguel of almost all vegetation in the early 1930s. But of course, as island foxes survived that, which is amazing, but they almost did not survive golden eagles in the 1990s. And there's some differences on the islands, and this is where the tinkering comes in. There's so many more species on the mainland than on the islands, and that's because only a few species make it out there. Species can only make it out by swimming or flying or being brought out there by humans. So there's 35 species of reptiles and amphibians on the mainland, only 3 to 6 on the islands. 10 species of rodent, only deer mice and harvest mice out here. Medium-sized carnivores, there's a couple on the mainland, there's a couple out here. There's no large carnivores on the islands at all. 13 species of raptor, only a couple on the islands, and no ungulates naturally on the islands at all, unless you go back and call pygmy mammoths ungulates, which I'll give you that one, but they haven't been there for a long time. But now there's mule deer, or there was mule deer on Santa Rosa, as well as elk and pigs on Santa Cruz, all brought by humans. And so those are some of the changes in the ecosystem that island foxes did not grow up with. And so that made them vulnerable to a large predator as well. And so when you think about some of the non-native influences on these northern Channel Islands, what you have is there was sheep grazing on all these islands, pretty extensive. On Santa Cruz, there were pigs brought out there in 1850 and lived there for about a century and a half. Cattle on Santa Cruz as well. On Santa Rosa, deer and elk were brought out in the early part of the 20th century for commercial hunting enterprise, and they were there until very recently. Pigs were there on that island until they were removed by the Park Service in 1993, and there was a cattle grazing operation on that island for most of the 20th century as well. So all of these had influences on the environment, but none of us could guess that they would have contributed to the almost extinction of the island fox. And the thing that was missing out there was bald eagles. Bald eagles bred on all the Channel Islands. Oh, there's a great map right over here. The bald eagles, there were as many as 20 to 25 nests of bald eagles on all 8 islands at one point. But they went extinct, locally extinct at least, in the northern Channel Islands and on the southern Channel Islands due to the DDT that was being manufactured in Long Beach, California, which is right over here, and it was leached out into the Southern California Bight, and it still sits in a big mass right under the ocean out there. And because of that, it got into the ecosystem. It causes eggshell thinning in eagles and in pelicans and in other birds. And that was mainly responsible for the fact that by 1950 or so, there were almost no bald eagles left on the northern Channel Islands. And why we think this is important for foxes is that bald eagles will not tolerate other large eagles in their territories. And had there been a breeding population of bald eagles on the islands, the golden eagles may not have been able to set up shop out there. But in fact, they did. And that's because the golden eagles found pigs out there on Santa Cruz Island. We learned this when we went into a golden eagle nest in 1999, the first one that was found on the islands, and found pig bones, which we did not expect to find. In fact, a later investigation looked at golden eagle nests, which were only discovered in the 1990s on Santa Cruz and on Santa Rosa. And on Santa Rosa, there were deer fawns in those nests there, and there were piglets in the nests on Santa Cruz Island. There was also everything else. They were supporting themselves during the breeding season on these non-native ungulates, but they were taking foxes, skunks, gulls, mice, snakes, almost everything else that was out there. In fact, it really wasn't good habitat for golden eagles, which is why they had to switch to a lot of other prey out there as well. But island foxes can be thought of as this indirect casualty of non-native species. The deer and the pigs allowed or supported golden eagles, which were not being kept away by bald eagles. So in 1999, we were in full crisis mode. We knew we had less than 20 foxes, actually 15 foxes apiece on Santa Rosa and Santa Cruz, 50 left on San Miguel and Santa Rosa, 50 on Santa Cruz. We knew we had golden eagles breeding on the islands and preying on island foxes. So we convened a bunch of biologists, and it was very logical what we all decided to do. We needed to put the remaining foxes into captivity. And the first thought was not even to breed them into captivity, but just to protect them from the golden eagles that were out there. We knew we had to trap and relocate those golden eagles. And we knew there were these longer-term, ecosystem-wide level actions that we needed to take to make the islands less inviting to golden eagles. And that was removing the alien species of pigs and ungulates and returning bald eagles to the island. And so that began about 10 years of very active recovery actions for island foxes. We did captive breeding on the islands because we didn't want to take foxes off the islands, expose them to diseases on the mainland, and have them come back and maybe introduce those diseases to the islands. So we had to do it out there. So that means we had to design pens, helicopter them out to the islands, build them with volunteers, and bring foxes into captivity, which means we had to learn how to raise island foxes. So we worked with the zoos on appropriate diet for island foxes, den boxes, how big an enclosure to keep them with, breeding strategies, and we started worrying about the fate of our individual island foxes. The 15 foxes that were left on Rosa and the 15 left on Miguel. We had a very strenuous program of veterinary care for them as well. We were really worried about the fate of individual foxes. We worked with zoos on something called behavioral enrichment because pens can be kind of boring. So we created lots of structures for them to climb up on, which they like a lot. And if you've been to the Santa Barbara Zoo, you can find those foxes in the trees out there. They're very arboreal. In fact, they have climbed out of their enclosure via the tree at the Santa Barbara Zoo, which caused the Santa Barbara Zoo to then put an enclosure over the top, which was pretty smart. But they're very adept at climbing. By 2003 and 2004, we had enough foxes in captivity to start releasing them to the wild. And we got lucky here, I think. They were relatively easy to breed in captivity. It wasn't a piece of cake, but we did increase our captive populations to our minimum level of 40 by 2003, and that enabled us to start releasing foxes back into the environment. And they were released back into an empty environment. It was ideal. There were no foxes left on San Miguel in 1999. So by the time in 2004 that we released them to the wild, they knew exactly what to do. And here's the first couple years of, these are males, male home use or home range right there, and a female. They paired up immediately out there, spread themselves out over the island, and started doing what they were supposed to do. In fact, we recorded a lot of reproduction out there in the wild with these automatic cameras that we trained on food traps. And the amazing thing about this is that the populations grew fairly rapidly, and they were doing so well in captivity, and are actually in the wild, that we decided to release them all by 2007, 2008, because they were reproducing more in the wild than they were in captivity, which was a great situation to be in. Many captive breeding populations and programs are not as lucky. Yeah, they take years to get animals to breed. Animals get hammered when they get out of the environment. To a large degree, we didn't have those problems with us. And that's because it's an advantage to work on islands. Because, you know, if you get rid of golden eagles or get rid of pigs, they're not going to come back on an island. So we had that advantage working for us as well. But we knew we had to relocate the golden eagles that were out there. So we worked with raptor biologists who set traps for them on the islands. These were large traps baited with dead pigs or live rabbits. The raptor would come in on it, and from about a mile away, the biologist would release the trap, which would spring a trap over the animal. And then those animals had to be transported to the mainland, which was quite a chore. But in fact, 44 golden eagles were taken off the islands in a 6-year period, which amazed us as well, because we thought maybe there were 10 or 12 golden eagles out there in 1999 when we started. There was an entire breeding population out there. In fact, they produced so many young that the genetics told us that they were sending recruits out to the mainland rather than coming out from the mainland to the islands. So that was remarkable, the establishment of golden eagles in the 1990s on Santa Rosa and Santa Cruz Islands. But we did remove the last of the breeding eagles in 2006. Since that time, we've had a few eagles show up every year or so, and they do take some foxes, but it hasn't been such a problem that it's holding back fox recovery. And one of the reasons is that the Channel Islands are not really good golden eagle habitat. Good golden eagle habitat is up here in the Sierra Nevada, where there's a ton of rabbits and ground squirrels. And these animals, the golden eagles that were released on the mainland, they were all released in the northeastern corner of California. And many of them dispersed from there, but none of them ever came back to the islands, which also tells us that it wasn't worth coming back to. They were in great habitat up there in the eastern Sierra. We had to make the islands less inviting for golden eagles, and one thing that was really obvious was the removal of feral pigs from Santa Cruz Island, which is something that the Nature Conservancy and the Park Service had wanted to do for a long time, because we know that the pigs were just rototilling the ground out there. They were affecting archaeological sites as well as plant species. There's about 10 plant species on Santa Cruz Island that are now endangered because of the pigs that had been out there for 150 years. So in a joint program with the Nature Conservancy, those pigs were removed in a very short period of time, 2005, 2006, and about 4,000 of them were removed. And the island is recovering at this point. We also knew that bald eagles were missing. That was a missing piece of the ecosystem out here. And so there was a settlement case from something called Montrose. Montrose was the name of that chemical company in Long Beach, California that produced DDT. And the settlement from that funded bald eagle restoration on Catalina Island and on the northern Channel Islands. Eaglets were obtained from Alaskan nests, or they were raised at the San Francisco Zoo and released in a process called hacking, in which birds are put in a tower out there, young birds about 6 weeks of age, they're still pretty large, and gradually the doors opened on that tower and they're allowed to go free for their first year. And so this was done for about 6 years. And now there's about 30 young bald eagles on the islands, and there's been breeding on Anacapa, Santa Cruz, and Santa Rosa Islands of bald eagles. And so it's been a very successful program so far. And once again, it's a dominant aerial marine predator out there. And the great thing about bald eagles is they are a marine bird. They eat fish, they eat seabirds such as gulls, and they eat pinniped carcasses. They don't eat terrestrial food the way that golden eagles do. So they pose no threat to island foxes pretty much whatsoever. And so right now we're at this very enviable stage when all of our hardcore recovery actions are pretty much over. We had a 10-year program of captive breeding and reintroduction. Removal of golden eagles is done. Reintroduction of bald eagles has been completed, and it's in a monitoring phase. Pigs were removed in a very short order from Santa Cruz, and deer and elk have recently been removed from Santa Rosa Island by the former owners of that island as well. And so right now we're in this phase of monitoring. These populations of island foxes, they're recovering, but they're still very vulnerable. So we have to stay on top of that. It's a death and taxes thing. It'll always be an issue for us because I think they are so, they're going to remain vulnerable because of their small population sizes. So what we do several things. We use those radio collars on about 50 foxes every year on each island because we want to know how many of our foxes are surviving every year, and of those that die, what are they dying from? Do we have eagle predation or disease out there? And the results have been very encouraging. This is Santa Rosa annual survival. We want it to be about 90%. And you can see the first couple years we had problems with eagle predation on Santa Rosa. We had some problems in 2010 with eagle predation on Santa Rosa as well. But it's climbed back up to 90%. San Miguel has been at 90% ever since we first released foxes in 2004. And with 90% survival and high reproduction, those populations are recovering themselves out there. And that's the other half of monitoring. We trap them every year on those small grids and count them and estimate the number of foxes on the islands. And so this is what the kind of data we come up with. The number of adult foxes on each of the islands. Here's that San Miguel graph. Remember, we had about 400 foxes in the 1990s. It went down to 15, 0 in the wild during the period of captivity. But now we've increased that wild population up to about where it was before we started. And you can see Santa Rosa is doing even better this year. We had a real bust-out year on Santa Rosa, and we're up to about 500 adult foxes on there. Santa Cruz has always had more foxes than the other two islands, and they've had a nice steady growth period. And you can see with the Santa Cruz and the San Miguel, we may be bouncing around some kind of carrying capacity. We may be at the capacity of the island to support island foxes at about 400 for Miguel and maybe 900 to 1,000 for Santa Cruz, which is a great position to be in as well. But of course, we're going to have to stay on this. We'll be monitoring them every year for quite some time. But we are looking at recovery of island fox populations. And I like this graph a lot, so you're going to see it next. I like looking at it. It almost, you know, you could say, hey, we're done. We're not entirely done. But it's very nice to look at. It's very reassuring, given the 20 years that have taken place. So what this means for island foxes is in some very soon, foxes will come off the list of endangered species. And that's because they have recovered so quickly. In fact, it's one of the fastest recoveries ever for an endangered species. A 10-year period of time since the decline started is very rapid. And so I think within a couple of years, you're going to see U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, with help from us, assessing these populations to see if they're truly invulnerable at some degree by their numbers. And probably within 2 years, you're going to see at least Miguel, Cruz, and Catalina come off the species, endangered species list. And that's because Catalina has greatly recovered from that distemper-caused decline in the 1990s as well. So this has been a good species to work with in that they know what they're doing when they're out in the field. That there has not been a problem with reproduction in the wild or with rapid recovery. We use an algorithm to look at this. This is San Miguel. This is adult mortality. That's high mortality. You want low mortality. This is adult population size. You want high population size. So these are lines of population extinction risk. And right now, our population is at less than a 5% risk of extinction in 50 years. And that's pretty safe. And that's the kind of thing that Fish and Wildlife Service is going to look at when they make a determination whether these guys can come off the list. But of course, that means we have to keep monitoring them through trapping them and through radio telemetry, which we will do. And we also have to do a couple other things. We have to develop plans to deal with eagles if they come back, and plans to deal with disease. Because island foxes are canines. They're very vulnerable to all kinds of diseases. And they haven't been exposed to a lot of them. They've had a great life out here on the Channel Islands, but if distemper gets out to an island, or parvovirus, or rabies, it could really decimate a population quickly. That's why we're going to have to come up with plans based on looking at radio-collared animals to see if those diseases show up. And we also have a very unique situation where we vaccinate island fox populations against canine distemper virus and against rabies every year. And it's very unusual in a national park to have a vaccination program for wild animals. But the reason is that distemper virus just ripped through the Catalina population in 1999 to 2000 and was barely caught. If rabies ever got out to the island, we probably could not catch it in time by the time we knew what was going on. So we keep a vaccinated core of animals out there. We keep about 100 animals vaccinated. And if we have to, we'll start a captive breeding population with those 100 animals if rabies gets out to the islands and takes care of the rest of them. So that's one thing that we'll probably do forever as well. But we'll look at the status of each of these 6 subspecies. Like on Miguel, here's that graph. I love it. We're back up to pre-decline numbers on Miguel. This decline from this bounce maybe against carrying capacity? Is it something we have to worry about? I don't think that it is. Here's the number of foxes that we caught on our grids since 2006. These are the different age classes. These are pups down here, 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, and the old guys are right there. And you can see that the population rapidly reached almost a plateau in 2008 and has been bouncing around there ever since. So I don't think I'm too worried about what we saw last year. It's a little bit of bounce, and right now the numbers are still good on San Miguel. On Santa Rosa, you can see it. We had a decline in 2010 due to that predation, and there was an early decline due to the eagles that were still on the islands when we released them, released foxes out there. But right now we are going through the roof on Santa Rosa. In fact, that's an 80% increase from 2011 to 2012, which they won't be able to sustain that, but that's a large island, and they may get up as close to 800 or 900 animals before they start bouncing too. So that's good news. And the recent removal of deer and elk just ensures that Santa Rosa is going to be a lot safer for island foxes. We had breeding golden eagles out there. They won't do that anymore without mule deer fawns to sustain them in the springtime. Santa Cruz, we're also close to pre-decline numbers, which is great. And on Catalina, there's that rapid population growth. On the other hand, Catalina has a lot going on. That has a city of Avalon. There's a lot of pets. There's cats and dogs on that island. There's no requirement for vaccinations. There's no quarantine requirements for bringing animals onto the island. So that means that there's a large possibility that unvaccinated animals that are carrying something will make it out to that island. But in fact, the funny thing is raccoons are probably a bigger concern on that island. Everyone assumed that the canine distemper virus that ripped through that population in 1999 was vectored by cats or dogs. But in fact, genetic work on that virus indicates it's more like raccoon distemper virus than anything else. And in the past 4 years, 5 raccoons have been found on that island. They have been seen swimming to shore from boats in Avalon Harbor and have been found, rummaging through trash cans in town. They've caught them all. But that's the kind of thing that we don't think we have to deal with up here. And unfortunately, Catalina will always be vulnerable to that type of thing. But at least they know about it by now. And they're, now the people that do the island fox work out there also try to keep track of other wildlife sightings. San Nicolas is a Navy-owned island. It's down here. It's behind Catalina and Santa Barbara Island. And there's been consistently high fox numbers down there, maybe about 500 foxes there for a long time, which is one reason it was not proposed to be listed as endangered. So it's a pretty stable population on San Nicolas. Feral cats were just removed from that island a year or so ago, and that will help island foxes as well. Cats compete with island foxes and are also a source of disease. So that helps ensure that population. And on San Clemente, there's a robust population of island foxes, maybe about 700 or 800 strong, and the Navy is actually leading the way in developing this epidemic response plan, a plan to deal with an epidemic, and the Institute for Wildlife Studies is doing that, should something occur or pop up on that island. So right now the future looks pretty good for island foxes. Future conservation, of course, we have to consider climate change. What's going to happen to foxes when temperatures get warmer? And it's not like they're a Sierra species. They're not going to have to move down in elevation or anything like that. But what it could do is change the distribution of some of its parasites. Parasites we don't even think are a problem right now could become more of a problem if they're passed around to a greater degree in a warmer environment. So we're going to have to start thinking about that. But the tools we have are monitoring and this cooperative conservation that has been the hallmark of island fox recovery since day one, where we brought in everybody on a volunteer basis to work on this. And it's kind of a new model of doing things. It's not waiting until something is officially threatened or endangered and then using a lot of federal resources to do it. We made a plea and the plea was answered. And it's been a great program to work in because of that. Monitoring we're going to be doing for a long time as well. And so right now things are okay. You know, we keep a wary eye on the foxes, and we think about a lot of things that could affect them because they're still at very low populations. And so in the blink of an eye, something could occur out there, but that's why we do monitoring. I want to just show you some of the recent technology and the research that's been going on island foxes. We've benefited a lot from that. There's a special type of radio collar called a proximity collar that if I'm wearing one and you're wearing one, and if we get within 30 feet, we record each other. And that lets us know social relationships. These are females right here, red males. You can see the thick band. That's the number of interactions between those two. Those are a pair. There's a pair of foxes right there, and that's probably a pair as well. And then they're also related to the younger foxes that are out there. So it helps us find out who's doing what out in the environment. It's been pretty interesting. GPS collars are another great tool. You know, a couple times a day, if I'm wearing a GPS collar, it sends a signal up to a satellite, and you can download that. And it's showing us how tight the territories are out there. These are all male island foxes, different colors, on Santa Rosa Island. Work done by Lisa Drake out of Cal Poly. And these are the pretty tight home ranges that these male island foxes have out there. And that's at a very low density. So they're going to be kind of packed as that population increases. But that's the way that society works. And also, it's very interesting because golden eagle predation would take a male here and a male here and a male there and would play hell with island fox social hierarchies out there. That's one thing we saw. There's a lot of mixing up when these territories break down because of predation. That's kind of interesting too. You are what you eat, and in island foxes you can tell what they eat based on their whiskers. Their whiskers actually are a good indication of growth for the past 4 or 5 months, and Seth Newsom uses stable isotopes to look at island fox diet that way. He clips off segments of those whiskers. He can tell what the foxes have been eating for the past 4 or 5 months. Like on San Miguel Island, the more heavy nitrogen you have in there, the more you favor lizards and mice. The more you favor some of these plant species. The more carbon you have in it, the more it goes to grasshoppers and mice, and the more plant species you have. So this is very interesting to me because this is in different parts of the island. You have foxes eating different things. Right here in the Cardwell Flats grid that we have, one of our grids, they're mainly eating lizards and some mice, whereas down here on Jackass Flats, they eat more crickets, more ice plant, and grasshoppers. And then there's this one fox out there who's a beachcomber, because that's a marine signature. He's eating marine species out there, probably sand crabs and things like that. So that technology is pretty cool too. It's probably down at Otter Harbor or Kyler Harbor. We've also looked at exposure of island foxes to various diseases because that's one thing we worry about even more than predation is disease in these island fox populations. So we take blood samples and we have them tested for antibodies to various diseases that we worry about. And it is very interesting because these are the 6 island fox populations. There are 5 diseases we test for, and you can tell each of these islands has a different exposure history to all these diseases. There's so much individuality going on that you cannot treat a San Miguel Island fox like a Catalina Island fox. San Miguel's have a lot of canine adenovirus in them, whereas the most canine distemper virus is probably found on San Nicolas. So this tells us, for example, San Miguel has never been exposed to coronavirus or herpes virus. They're vulnerable to that, whereas coronavirus really is not a problem in Catalina because the more you have in it, the more you're protected from it. So this is the kind of thing we look at in island foxes to try and predict what the problems are going to be in the future in terms of disease, but of course there are diseases and parasites out there that we don't know about yet. So that's the news from the island fox world, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about that.
Tim, on Catalina, did they not have any golden eagle predation at all? It was all distemper?
That's right. And the funny thing about that is, if you look at the Northern Channel Islands, they're right there. They're rather close to the coast, and they're close to the Los Padres National Forest, which is a great source of golden eagles. Down here in the south, they're further away from any golden eagle territory. They're near these big urban areas. So golden eagles really never made it out to the southern islands. It's just a northern island phenomenon.
Okay, second question regarding Catalina. Because of the raccoons and the non-vaccinated dogs and cats, do they do a higher percentage of vaccination for the foxes out there?
Absolutely, they do. You know, we keep about 100 vaccinated animals. They keep close to 300 or 400 vaccinated animals. And they vaccinate all over the island because there's so many different entry points where a dog could come ashore from a private boat. That's a good point.
When you had the foxes removed from the islands, did you keep them segregated by island?
Yes, we did. And that's because they're very different from each other, even though they've only been around 10,000 years, and they've only been separated from each other 9 to 5,000 years. There's a lot of genetic differences among the 6 subspecies. There's some physical differences as well. For example, San Miguel foxes, the furthest one out, have a longer rostrum, and they have a shorter tail. They have less tail vertebra. So there's some physical differences as well. And if you're a fox biologist, you're more likely to get bit by one on Miguel than on Santa Cruz. So we know that. Because of that, and because Fish and Wildlife Service recognizes these 6 subspecies, we didn't want to mix them. We want to retain San Miguel Island foxes and Santa Rosa Island foxes. That's a good question.
Clarification. I think he asked for removal, and you didn't remove them.
Tim, sorry, I think he asked if you removed them and put them in separate pens. I think you left them each on their own island.
That's right. We managed them separately. Yeah, so we did not put San Miguel Island foxes in the same captive breeding facility as Santa Rosa. We had one facility on Rosa, one on Miguel, and one on Santa Cruz.
Yeah, Tim, are on each and every island, is the behavior of the fox the same as we see on our islands in terms of being oblivious to?
No. Well, for example, if you've been out to Santa Cruz, we have a lot of problems right now with island foxes in the campground begging. We don't have a lot of that on San Miguel at all, where they are more skittish. So there are behavioral differences among the different islands as well. And I think that has a lot to do with the human presence on the islands. There hasn't been that much human presence on Miguel. There's been a lot more in Santa Cruz. There's a ton on Santa Catalina. So there are some behavioral differences in that way, mainly regarding whether they're skittish or not.
Yeah, along that same vein with the foxes begging on Santa Cruz. I know we're supposed to tell people not to feed them, but you know darn well some of those people are feeding them. Is that a concern, and where might that lead? What could that cause as a problem?
Luckily, it's a localized problem, and I'm actually more hopeful about this than that. I've been out there, and I've talked to the rangers and the interpretive staff. They do a great job of telling people not to feed the animals, and they provide lots of opportunities for people to stow their food in very safe places. So I think if it's going on, it's inadvertent at this point. It's maybe some pasta going out with the wash water, and it's only in the campground. We don't see this behavior elsewhere on the island. Unfortunately, there's a couple families of foxes that live in the campground and around it, and they are passing these bad habits on to their kids. So you can only do so much.
You mentioned there was differences in the physiognomy of the foxes. Is that translated into any dietary differences from each of the islands?
That's a great question, too. Brian Seifer from Cal State Bakersfield recently did a scat-based diet analysis of island foxes. So we all sent him scat from different islands, and he found which is fun. Scat's cool. And he found differences among the islands. For example, mice were more important to foxes on Santa Rosa. Okay, not sure why that is. But in fact, island foxes, they're eating everything that's out there. And the food items are different on each island. You have large items like cruise, there's more vegetation species. They have access to more fruits and berries than do Miguel, where there's hardly a tree at all on Miguel. So there are differences among the foxes in their diet, but I think it's just based on whatever's available to them. I don't think it's a matter of choice at that much.
While you're on the subject of scat, I was on San Nicolas recently for 5 days, and I've been wanting to know why the scat on San Nicolas that comes from the foxes looks like it came from a 35-pound dog. It's absolutely huge.
I'm not familiar with that.
And I've seen foxes scat on all the islands, and this is like major, and nobody there knew, but they'd noticed that it was
So
different.
it's like German Shepherd size.
It's
scat.
not quite,
Okay.
but like a 30-pound dog, not a 4-pound fox.
Okay. That's very interesting.
And none of us noticed seeds or berries or anything like that.
Yeah.
And very, very dark.
Okay. I do know on San Nicolas they eat a lot of snails on that island because there's a ton of snails out
Right.
there. I don't know if that translates into larger poops or not, but
It was just, it was remarkably different. That's why we all noticed it.
Uh-huh.
It was just so different.
a lot of reference. That's right. I will look into that. That's intriguing.
You didn't mention sheep as having any effect on drawing the golden eagles out there. They have any?
I don't think that happened. The golden eagles arrived in the mid-1990s. I don't know if they were attracted by the sheep that were still on Santa Cruz Island at that time or not. But there's not much sheep bones at all in the golden eagle nests from that island. It's mainly pigs and everything else. So maybe some of them were initially attracted out there, but it's the feral pigs that supported golden eagle breeding on Santa Cruz Island.
How about barking, howling, behaviors like that? And are they precipitated by, parked vehicles or airplanes, or they have any similarity to coyotes or
None
foxes?
whatsoever. They're very quiet.
They do bark, though, right?
They bark occasionally, and they make other weird noises, but you hardly hear it at all. So they don't howl like coyotes or wolves or anything like that, and I'm not sure why that is.
You mentioned nocturnal
Uh-huh.
and carnivorous, but you also mentioned they were daytime and also ate
Right.
plants.
Um,
So where do we go with that?
They're everything. Their highest period of activity is from probably midnight to 4 or 5 in the morning, but they're not strictly nocturnal. You can find them hunting at all times of day. So they're just not as nocturnal as carnivores here are on the mainland. And as far as carnivory goes, technically they're carnivores, they're part of the order Carnivora, but their diet is omnivorous. They take everything that's out there.
So if we see like 4 pups playing around with one parent nearby, that's a daycare center? I mean, is this
No.
something that they only have
Litters,
1 or 2?
they can have litters from 1 to 4. The average litter is 2, but you'll see litters of 3 and 4 out there. Yeah, the average is 2 though. Yeah.
I heard that they hired or brought in New Zealand hunters to get rid of the pigs. Is that true?
That's true.
And how'd they get rid of all the non-native?
The contractors that the Nature Conservancy hired to remove the pigs were a New Zealand firm, and so they mainly used helicopters and dog teams and trapping to rid the island of pigs, and they actually did it in a very short order. It took less time than many people thought it would.
And what about the elk and deer and?
The elk and deer were removed by by the former owners of the island recently as part of a settlement. This settlement was first arranged in about 1997 or 1998, where there was going to be a phased withdrawal of those deer and elk as the owners gradually left the island. So that's what happened on Santa Rosa Island, and that's almost completed as of this point. Mm-hmm.
No, that's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I had a question. You know, it was kind of interesting that that Santa Rosa had a higher historic population of foxes than Santa Cruz on one of the slides. I was wondering if that strikes you as odd.
I wouldn't put any stock in that.
Okay.
And this is how those 1994 estimates were generated. We had estimates from San Miguel, we had estimates from Santa Cruz, and the biologist who made an estimate for Santa Rosa pretty much averaged those two. So it wasn't based on any field work on Santa Rosa. But he published the paper, so that's the number we use. But we're going to find out how high they get, Bill, and I'll make sure and tell you about that. Okay.
If humans occupied the islands for several thousand years ago, and the foxes occupied the islands several thousand years ago, were there any interactions, or did they just ignore each other? Or
I think there was a variety of interactions. Some of them came into camp and were fed by the Native Americans there, absolutely. On the other hand, the Native Americans on some islands had dogs, and that had to be, you know, some kind of source of conflict with animals that might come in. As I think I mentioned before, the Chumash probably had a semi-religious relationship with island foxes, did not eat them. They were probably important to them ceremonially, transported them to other islands as well. So there was a lot of interactions with some of the foxes. On the other hand, the foxes that were out in the hinterland were probably doing their own thing. It's a very adaptable, malleable species, I think.
Tim, I had just one last question. And you said that the fox has been out there for at least 16,000 years.
That's at the very most.
The most has been out there for.
The current thinking is probably 10,000 years.
10,000 years.
That 16 was based on a fossil that was redated to I think as only 6,000 years. So 16 is when the Pleistocene breakup occurred, and it was thought originally that maybe that's when island foxes made it out. But there's no fossil evidence to support that older date at this point.
Now, sometimes an animal's occupation is based on genetic, and so does that match the fossil evidence to say 10,000, or is it different, or has it been studied?
You have to have a beginning point for a molecular clock or a genetic clock, and right now there isn't a good genetic or a beginning point. All we know is 6,000 years. It's the oldest island fox fossil that's from the record. That doesn't mean there's another one out there that isn't older. You never know what's out there that you don't know about. But at this point, it's thought that perhaps they've only been out there at the most 10,000 years, which is, well, it's very interesting to think about because they may have been out there when pygmy mammoths were in the environment. You know, pygmy mammoths did not survive, but island foxes did. Island foxes saw a lot of Native Americans come and go, some of which had dogs. So they actually survived a lot in whatever period of time they were out there.
Well, they're pretty smart animals.
Obviously.
They're foxes. Well, let's give let's give a big hand of applause.